I also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about literacy development, because that's also really important. It kind of fits in with much of what we've already looked at in terms of academic supports. But if we're really focusing in on literacy, some of the things that we want to think about are things like vocabulary, just learning words, and SightWord reading. We might be thinking about reading comprehension, understanding what we've read. And then we also might be targeting an individual's ability to write or compose text, right? Sentences, paragraphs, and so on. Right? So at a very early level, we might have something like this. This is a book that I laminated. I ripped it apart. I do that a lot with books. I rip it apart, I laminate it, and I put it back together. It's again where packing tape comes in handy. And I made symbols for the colors. This was a book about colors. And this was one of the first books that I had adapted for Darren when we were sort of starting to transition him to using symbols and getting him to look at two-dimensional representations and learn that they meant stuff. And so he did not need to read the word purple to know which symbol went on the page, right? Because he could color match. But I'm still exposing him to the text. Right? The other thing that we did with this book is because each page the bear put on a piece of clothing that was the color of whatever. So in this case, the color is purple and he's putting on purple socks. So we just also put a symbol for the clothing item on the page as well and worked on having Darren match the symbol to the clothing item so that he's learning what those symbols mean, right? So that's something that you can do. Just picture books and work on, here's a symbol that matches this picture. Match, that's it. You might be interested in working on SightWord reading, right? So we can do all kinds of things, typically that involve matching pictures or matching symbols to printed words. And we can do structured teaching activities. We can do games. My master's thesis was specifically on an intervention to teach kids to read sight words through a series of matching activities. And if you guys want, I can probably find a copy of that could get put up online for people to access. You can also do worksheets where kids are matching. And so matching is a great way, particularly for kids with autism again, or kids who aren't speaking. How do you know if they understand a word? Well, if they can match the printed word to the picture, you have a sense of them understanding what that means, right? Because a lot of times our assessment of kids' ability to read is based on their ability to say the words that they're reading. And for kids who don't talk, then the assumption is that they can't read, right? And often they are reading. We just don't have a good way of assessing that all the time. So then matching activities could look something like this. So this is one of those little half books that you can get Blackline Masters for. Those of you who are teachers are familiar with this idea, and they're like those little half books that you shove through the photocopier, and the kids can read them in the classroom and take them home to mom and dad. So this is the half book page. There's one full-size page that I would put at the back. I'd laminate everything, and the full-size page held all of the symbols that were needed for the book. And the student would match the symbols to the words, right? This was a super, super simple book. I think the whole book was my hat, my coat, my dad, the end. That was the book, right? But an early sight word kind of book. And this way I could have my kids read the book by matching the symbols, okay? This is a matching worksheet. Remember the student I told you about with her communication book who went to McDonald's, who used it so well? She turned out to be a reader. She read way more than anybody ever knew she was reading. I started to figure out that perhaps she was reading when I would watch her looking at comic books, and she'd laugh at points that were funny, but the funny wasn't always conveyed in the picture. And I thought, oh, you're reading something here. you can do more than we think. But this was her spelling test. Nobody had engaged her in spelling in the classroom. And I was like, well, let's teach her this. She can have the same spelling words. Let's give her spelling words. And instead of her writing the words, because she didn't understand when the teacher signed the words to the class, it's like, okay, well, we'll just give her a matching worksheet and she can match, right? Eventually we got to the point where her spelling test was pictures of the words and a line, and she would write the word, right? There is a caution about sight word reading and sight word reading instruction. People get very excited when kids start matching print to text or print to pictures, and it's a fairly simple thing to teach kids to do. It's not a difficult thing to teach. Sometimes people think that that means they read, period, with comprehension, and it does not, right? And in fact, for kids with autism, this is often a problem. Even kids with autism who have decent language skills and can say what they're reading, they might read a bunch of words way beyond what even might be an appropriate level given their age, but they're reading all this text with zero understanding, right? And that's not uncommon for kids with autism. Even if we're working with kids who don't have that ability, but we're teaching them to match pictures to print, just because they can match a bunch of single words to individual pictures doesn't mean that they can read and understand a sentence or a paragraph. That's an entirely different skill, right? So this is a beginning, but this is not the end, right? And reading also involves a bunch of other skills. Less for deaf kids. Deaf kids can't learn about sound-symbol relationships. We have to attack reading a different way. But for hearing kids, there are a bunch of phonological skills that they need to learn. How sounds and symbols work together. How to decipher a word that you don't know. How do you decode that based on your understanding of the letters and the sounds that they make, right? So sight word reading is part of it, but it's a small part of overall literacy, right? So people sometimes get very excited. He can read 120 sight words, woohoo! He understands nothing that he reads. That's a problem, right? Okay? So you have to be careful about that, right? So we need to work on directly teaching comprehension. And the way that I try to conceptualize this with students is that you need to make pictures in your head when you read, which then is perfect for visual supports, because visual supports are all about pictures, right? So it's a nice way of helping students start to understand what it is they're supposed to do when they're reading. So again, for lots of our kids, matching is a strength. They're good at matching. I might start to tackle comprehension by having them match sentences to illustrations. This sentence means this image, right? So that's a good way. Sometimes it's one sentence to one illustration. Sometimes it's several sentences to one illustration that depicts the overall content. Sometimes I can have students develop their comprehension by drawing pictures themselves, right? So now they're not choosing from a closed set, they're creating their own illustration, which really tells me that they're comprehending, right? Because they can make their own picture to show me their understanding. But we can do some simple things like this, right? This is a book that a student was writing about Easter, right? So green Easter eggs, and this is something that he glued in. So he would do the sentences, and then he'd have these illustrations, and he'd need to glue the illustrations to the correct sentence, and if coloring was involved, color appropriately, right? So that's basic early comprehension. This we looked at when we talked about sequencing, but this also required comprehension. The student needed to read "the hen cut the wheat," and we provided some symbol support because she didn't have all that vocabulary yet, but she needed to understand "cuts the wheat" to match to the illustration of the wheat being cut, right? So early comprehension. And then there was this example, right? This was my student who was doing Charlotte's Web, drawing illustrations for specific sentences. And that's how I assessed the student's understanding of what she was reading, right? If the pictures that she drew were appropriate given the sentences she was reading, I felt fairly secure in saying she's comprehending the text, right? Because she didn't have another way to tell me, okay? So that's comprehension, important to pay attention to, and it also kind of leads us into writing. So a lot of times for kids who are early in terms of writing, and by writing I don't mean the physical task necessarily of writing, but the composing part of writing, putting words together into sentences and so forth. We can use some of those same strategies. So again, matching is something that I use a lot. So I can have students write by matching a sentence to an illustration or a picture, and they're not actually coming up with their own words yet, but that's the first step towards writing. I might do what are called close activities, so they have part of the sentence, but there's a blank, and they need to fill in the blank. So I'll show you some examples of that. And then we'll also look at some ways of using some color coding and some grids of vocabulary, and how we can structure some grids of vocabulary to help students put words together to create sentences. So let's look at some of those examples. This is an example of matching to write. There was a student's face in here. This is his little wreath that he made, and so then it said his name made a wreath, right? So this teacher had a whole bunch of photographs she had taken of the kids in all of their pre-Christmas activities in one pocket chart. And then she made a bunch of sentences, and she had those in a different pocket chart. And the students would come up and choose a photo that they wanted to write about, and then they had to go find the sentence that went with the picture. And then they did the tracing part of the writing and pasted it on the page. And in the end, it was a class book, right? So that kind of thing. This is an example for another student who had been learning about prepositions. And his SEA came up with this brilliant idea. After he'd learned in, on, under, beside, between, and all of that, she took him across the street to the park with a Polaroid camera and a little cloth grab bag with all of the symbols for the prepositions he had learned. And he would reach into the bag and pull out a symbol, and if it said on, he had to go get on something, and she'd take a picture. And then she had all of these pictures of him in, on, under, beside, between, made symbol sentence strips, and this had his name, and he could read his name. And in ASL, we don't sign is. And so she symbolized the preposition because he couldn't read those words. And then he wrote the book by matching the photograph to the sentence strip, and that was his writing, okay? This is an example of a close activity for writing. So same student, we were still working on prepositions, but in this case it was, where's the pumpkin? The pumpkin is beside the vampire or under the ghost or whatever. And so this student had a bunch of symbols of prepositions and needed to choose the right preposition to fill the blank. Right? So this wasn't a student who was able to spell words independently yet, but we were working on, you need to take a word and put a word in this space, right? And here's another example. Halloween is jack-o'-lanterns. And notice how neat and tidy this little thing is there. That's one of my other tricks that I would use for kids who have really challenging motor skills, right? Their motor skills are poor, and writing is hard. And so you can see for this student, this was a student who was 12, right? And despite lots of printing practice, printing was not going to be his thing. So he would do some printing, but I also asked mom if she would purchase a label maker from the office store. The label makers are cheap, so I also have to warn the parents and say, where the real expense is in the label maker tape, right? But I had some parents who were willing to purchase and keep us stocked in tape, so long as we didn't have students using their label makers to write paragraphs. They could do that on the computer. But for all of these kind of fill in the blank things or spelling tests, stuff where you just need a few individual words, kids would use their label maker. Type it out on the label maker, press print, and then the word comes out and they can stick it on their page. In some instances, that's faster than using the computer to write a few words. At our school, if you printed, we were downstairs, the printout came out in the printer upstairs, so then it was like a 5-minute trip to go find your paper, and it was usually in the mess of somebody else's 50 papers, and right, so it was easier to just have a label maker. So you can do stuff like that. Here's an example of a close activity related again to that Napoleon unit, right? So Napoleon was what on August 15th, 1769? And here are two choices. Choose the right one to fill in the sentence. The capital, whatever the city is the capital of, and then where, right? So the student had to select the correct word and paste, right? So those are examples of close activities that we can use. And we could color code any of these, right? So if I had a student who didn't know the answer, I could color code this green and this green so that the student knew which answer to pick, right? So depending on the student's level, I can make it easier or harder, right? I could also make this harder by adding more options, right? So instead of 3 options, it could be 6 options, which requires the student to know more, right? To be able to discriminate better, okay? So those kinds of things we can do. And then we can also use color coding, like color coding to support writing. Again, in kind of an errorless approach. This idea of color coding provides students with some extra cues to get the right words in the right place, right? So if they don't yet have the ability to come up with the right words and sequence them in a correct manner, we can just use color coding to help them along. So for example, whales swim. I know that grammatically not correct. Deaf kid doesn't hear the S anyway, so whales swim, not that important. At this point, we were just working on it's a whale and it's swimming. Right? We're happy with that. We'll worry about the rest later. But we color coded, so the background was blue-yellow, and we were just working on combine a noun and a verb, noun and a verb. And then there was the illustration, and we used to do illustrations on index cards. So as my student would put sentences together, the SEA's job was to do a quick sketch on an index card, keep all of the illustrations to the side, and once the student had made all of his sentences, she'd mix up all the index card illustrations, lay them out on the desk, and he had to go back through his sentences and then find the correct illustration. So now we're talking back about comprehension. So I wrote something, what did it mean, right? And then you remember the Cinquain poem that we talked about earlier, right? The Mother's Day poem. Okay, so the brainstorming sheets were color-coded, right? The sheet for descriptive words was blue, copied onto blue paper. The sheet for the verbs was green, copied onto green paper. After all of the brainstorming was done, the teacher gave the class instructions about the format of the Cinquain. It was supposed to be mom, then 2 descriptive words, 3 verbs, 2 descriptive words, and mom. That was the structure. Now my student wasn't going to understand or remember that, so we gave her a color-coded form like this, and she used those same pages that she used for brainstorming, cut out the symbols that she wanted in her poem, and glued them into place. And then this was her poem, and her poem got laminated. It was a big one. Her actual poem got laminated. She presented it to Mom for Mother's Day. Mom cried appropriately, right? It was all good. So she said, Mom, good, happy, loving, cleaning, dusting. So she had a sense of what Mom was doing at home while she was at school. Strong, smart mom, right? And so that was Mom's Mother's Day present. From a daughter who did not have much language, right? Remember, she was asking for bathroom and cookie, right? But she was able to select words to talk about her mom and give her mom a present for Mother's Day, right? So everybody cried appropriately to that. The other kind of support that we can provide in terms of writing are grids, where we're providing a student with vocabulary that's kind of structured in the right order to help them with putting words together in the right order, right? We can then start to work on things like subject-verb agreement or plurals, what kind of word. So again, you can make this as easy or as difficult as you want to be, depending on the skills that you're trying to address with your student. And then students can do their writing by cutting out the symbols and words and pasting them if they don't have good motor skills. They could physically print or write with a pencil, or they could type it out on a computer or a tablet or a label maker or what have you. Right? So here are some examples of that. This was part of a behavioral intervention actually for a student that I was supporting. He was in a regular classroom for journal writing. And he's a bit of an attention seeker, and he particularly enjoys peer attention. And so while all of the children were supposed to be writing in their journals, he was doing things like poking them and making faces because they would react. So the teacher came to be concerned that he wasn't going to be able to remain in the classroom for journals if we didn't deal with this. And I knew that he loved photographs. He would die for photographs. So what I said to Mom was, could you just take pictures of him and things that your family are doing and just email them to me as you take them? Oh yeah, sure, no problem. And so for every picture that she sent me, I would make a writing grid. And so one photo would have a grid to support him in making some sentences, and I'd give them all to the teacher, so the teacher had a file of several photos and several grids, and so when it was journal time, he could flip through and choose the photo he wanted to write about, right? So on this day, he chose this picture. He loved Woody, loved. And they'd gone to see Disney on Ice, right? And then he made a point, because when he saw this, I was around, and I had written Buzz, silly me. And he's like, that is wrong. W-O-O-D-Y, not Buzz. So I had to fix that, and he thought that was quite humorous. So it's got Woody, Jesse, and I as the first word in any sentence. He's gonna write 3 sentences. Woody can skate, Jesse can skate, I can skate. There are his sentences, there's the photo in his journal. Now, because it was a photo and because he was so highly motivated by photos, that took care of him bothering his peers, right? We also made the task a little bit easier for him. How do you put a sentence together? Because he didn't quite have that skill. He was a great speller. He loved coming in the morning and going G-O-O-D-M-O-R-N-I-N-G-B-R-E-N-D-A, ha ha ha. He thought he was hilarious, right? So that's what he'd do every morning. He could spell like nobody's business, but he wasn't yet making sentences. So this way, the task was a bit easier, and it directed him. Took care of all our problem behavior. No more problem behavior. Teacher would offer him up choices. He'd do his writing, and then like everybody else, once you've written in your journal, you're allowed to like find a buddy and read it to your buddy, and then find another buddy and read it to your buddy, and so on and so forth, right? So that's what we did. We can do writing grids for individuals at higher levels. So this, remember the Venn diagram about animal and plant cells? Well, here's a writing activity related to animal and plant cells. So plant cells have, and then whatever it is that plant cells have, right? Again, you can make this an errorless thing, or you can make it be some of these things are not about plant cells, they're about animal cells, and you need to discriminate which are the correct endings for the sentence, right? Here's an example of a writing grid for a science activity, right? So this was a science experiment, and what we would do for this student is actually take the grid, cut everything out, lay it all out, and then he'd choose the right words and create his sentence that way. So in this case, it was, I put water in the bottle. That was one of the steps of an experiment, right? There's what it looks like. I put the tack in the bottle. That was the next step. And there's his bottle with a water line and the tack, right, showing what he did. So he's learning how to write about information. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. The other thing that we can do, and I'm not talking about it a whole lot, mostly because when we start talking about math, people usually find that easier to do in terms of visual supports, and also because there are manipulative materials with math. So I usually find that people don't have as much difficulty adapting math stuff, so I'm not spending a lot of time talking about math stuff, but again, we can certainly use visual supports to help convey some of those concepts. We can also use visual supports when we get to the point of starting to teach students the steps to solving particular problems. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples of how we can do that. Visual supports for addition, I've made before great big pages that sit on a student's desk. They have their worksheet and they have a dry erase pen. And so they write the problem down. So for example, 3 + 2. Then they have their blocks. 1, 2, 3 blocks, 1, 2 blocks, and then I teach them to swipe all the blocks over to the equals side, then they count the blocks. I've got a number chart down here. If they can't count, they literally can take each block and put it on a number, and the last number that a block is on is the number that you write down, 5, right? So you can do addition that way. I've also done similar things for subtraction, so teaching an individual to write down the equation. We've got 3 - 2. There are 3 blocks, and then the way that we do subtraction is that we move block 1 and block 2 to show the -2 part. And then the block that's left here, we swoop over to the equal sign. And our answer is 1. Right? So teaching kids how to do that kind of process. And then I wanted to alert you to a resource. I was at the ABA International Conference in Denver in May, and I went to the most incredible session, one of the best sessions I've ever seen about adapting stuff. Dr. Fred Spooner has a whole bunch of graduate students, and this is the work of some of his grad students. And his whole focus forever has been on supporting kids with significant intellectual disability in classroom settings, in academic tasks, meaningfully. And so he and his colleagues had what's called the Solutions Project. And it's a structured behavior analytic program, so based on applied behavior analysis, designed to teach students with intellectual disabilities to solve word problems. And they've been doing research. So they developed a program, and then they did research on this. And it also involved having peers in the classroom provide the supports, right? So it was also peer supported. This is just one of the examples of the materials, but all of their materials and all of their instructions are available online for free. Right? It's a federally granted project. So everything is available for free. So take a look at that, particularly if you're supporting individuals in terms of word problem solving. They've got really awesome materials and really nice descriptions of exactly how to implement. Right? They do great work. Okay? So lots and lots of things that we can do in terms of visual supports.